an absolutely thrilling year. I wouldn't have given it up for the world. The homework was another story. But today, I want to talk to you about what got me to law school in the first place, and hopefully light a fire under all of you in the way that I first felt this as I started researching the topic. It's appropriate today that this talk today be done on the day, the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, because we're going to talk about a different form of oppression, one that's even a little bit more pernicious. And I also have a dream, and that dream is that our food supply would confer wellness, not illness. I have to take care of obese kids, and we're losing the battle. And the problem is we're going to continue to lose the battle until we fix the food supply, and I'm going to try to explain to you why that is and what we can do about it during the course of this lecture. I hope it won't be so hyperbolic as to get you all, shouting in the aisles. It's not quite a revival, but there's going to be a lot of science, and the science should influence the policy. The problem is the politics get in the way, but that's where law comes in. So with that, let's go ahead and start. So first of all, I have no disclosures. No food industry concern is putting me up to this, I promise you. So in 2011, just 2 years ago, the UN Secretary General announced that non-communicable disease, that is, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, was now a bigger problem, not just for the developed world, but now for the developing world, than was infectious disease, including HIV. This is a paradigm shift as to how medicine is going to be conducted from here on in and where the resources have to go. And the question is, how do you deal with this? So they plan to target tobacco, alcohol, and diet. Now, tobacco and alcohol, that's easy. And we have paradigms that already work for those. We have 15 years of alcohol control policy, for instance. But what about diet? Are we going to influence total calories? Well, we've been doing that for 30 years, and look where we are. We're going to do that with changing fat. We did that for 30 years, and look where we are. Red meat, dairy, if you believe Esselstyn and Caldwell, carbohydrate. What is the factor within our diet? We can't stop eating. Something has to change, but what is it? I think all of these are incorrect. I'm going to let Will Smith tell you what the real answer to this story is.
What? I guess I owe you some answers, Hoss.
Oh, what, you feeling chatty all of a sudden?
Sorry, I can't talk right now. I got some secret cases of my own I'm working on.
I hate to tear you away from your video game.
All right, I'm hanging up.
You know the most destructive force in the universe?
Sugar?
If Hollywood knows this, why don't you? Anyway, here's the problem. It's very clearly delineated on this slide. And this comes from Coca-Cola's Coming Together YouTube video. It's a 2-minute commercial where they are going to tackle childhood obesity. And they say straight out, beating obesity will take action by all of us based on one simple common sense fact. All calories count, no matter where they come from, including Coca-Cola and everything else with calories. In other words, a calorie is a calorie, and you can get those calories from carrots or cheesecake or Coca-Cola or anything else with a K. But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter where it comes from. Calorie is a calorie. Well, that's based on common sense. Well, I don't believe in common sense. I believe in data. And the data say something else entirely. Because what the data say is that some calories cause disease more than other calories, because different calories are metabolized differently in the body. Not every calorie is handled the same way, and that means that a calorie is not a calorie. And that is what I've spent the last 16 years figuring out, and I'm not the only one who's figured this out. Many other investigators have figured this out, and this is now a wave of controversy throughout the endocrine and the nutritional literature and at meetings. I just debated the Corn Refiners Association just a week ago on exactly this point. So the question is, if a calorie is not a calorie, could there be calories that are worse than others? So, of course, we know that there are certain environmental toxicants that are certainly bad for you, as witness tobacco. The question is, what about this stuff over here? Is this possible? Could this be the problem? So I'm going to be referring now to two papers. One is actually a New York Times Magazine article written by Gary Taubes about our research at UCSF, and also our Nature comment last year, where we actually called for regulation. So in order to regulate an environmental substance, society has said that you have to fulfill 4 criteria. Unavoidability or ubiquity, you can't get away from it. Toxicity, it has to be dangerous. Abuse, you can't stop using it. And finally, externalities or negative impact on society. How does your use affect me? Those are the 4, and I have to show you that sugar meets every single one of those 4 in order to even be able to stand up here and talk about it. So let's start with unavoidability. Now, we are all eating more, no argument. 275 calories more in teen boys over the past 20 years. No argument. We are eating more. The question is, what are we eating more of? Is it fat? We were told to go low fat. We're not eating more fat. We are actually eating the same amount of fat as we were before. 5 grams up, 45 calories of those 275 calories of fat. And if you look at the secular trends in specific food intake, here are the fats. Whole milk, way down. Meat and cheese up very slightly. Milk desserts up minimally. Bottom line, it's a wash. We are not eating more fat. In fact, as our percent calories from fat have gone from 40 to 30%, because the AMA, the AHA, and the USDA remanded us to back in the 1980s, as we were to go low fat, our obesity and metabolic syndrome prevalence has gone through the roof. No, it's not fat. What are we eating more of? We're eating more carbohydrate. 228 calories, 57 grams in teen boys. And here's the trend in carbohydrate intake, all up through the roof. That's what we're eating more of. And of course, remember, that was the bottom of the food pyramid. And specifically, what carbohydrate? Well, beverages, for that matter. 41% increase in soft drinks, 35% increase in fruit drinks, fruit aids, etc. This slide sort of says it all. Okay? Here is the original bottle of Coca-Cola, 6.5 ounces, out of Atlanta in 1915. If you drank one of those every day for a year, assuming that the formula hasn't changed, and we don't know if the formula has changed because only 3 people in the world know the formula, and they're not allowed to ride the plane at the same time, that would be worth 8 pounds of fat per year. Now, in 1955, after sugar stopped being rationed after World War II, we got up to 10 ounces, 13 pounds of fat per year. Now the Cokes were sold in vending machines. Then the ever ubiquitous 12-ounce can at 16 pounds of fat per year. And here we have the current, ever-present 20-ounce Coca-Cola. Everybody know how many servings you get out of that 20 ounces? It's supposed to be 2.5 8-ounce servings. Anybody know anybody who gets 2.5 8-ounce servings out of that? That's a whole serving. So that's worth 26 pounds of fat per year. And then you have the 7-Eleven, Big K, Thirstbuster, Big Gulp, etc. 44 ounces, 57 pounds of fat per year if you did that every day. And my friend Dr. Dan Hale at the University of Texas, San Antonio, tells me that down there they got a Texas-sized Big Gulp, 60 ounces of Coca-Cola, a Snickers bar, and a bag of Doritos, all for 99 cents. So you'd say, well, QED, that's the obesity epidemic right there. Well, you would be only partially right. So what is this stuff? Well, in America, it's this stuff, high-fructose corn syrup. Our current annual consumption is 63 pounds per person, but there's a problem. The problem is only the US, Canada, and Japan use it. There's very limited exposure in parts of Europe, yet the rest of the world has just as much of an obesity and metabolic syndrome epidemic as we do. In fact, everybody is so fond of Mexican Coke. Mexico has the highest increase in the rate of obesity in the world today. And they don't have high-fructose corn syrup. They have sucrose. So here's high-fructose corn syrup up here. 1 glucose, 6-membered ring. 1 fructose, 5-membered ring. And they are free. They are not bound together. But here's sucrose. 1 6-membered ring, 1 5-membered ring, O-glycosidic linkage linking the two. Your enzyme in your intestine called sucrase cleaves this in about a nanosecond. You absorb the two moieties. Basically, it's a wash. They're the same. They are equivalent. And all of the studies pitting the two of them against each other show that they are equivalent. They are equivalently bad. That's the problem. And that's why every other country has the exact same problem as we do. Here's what US sugar consumption has done as we have developed the ability to refine, isolate it, and market it. So we've gone from 4 pounds per year, which was basically from honey, all the way up, and you can see the different parts of the curve. Here's the growth of the sugar industry in the late 1890s through the early 1900s, and then stabilization just before World War II. Here's the dip from rationing right here. And here's the introduction of high-fructose corn syrup, and also as we were remanded to reduce our fat. And you can see how high things have gone. Now you'll notice, in the last 5, 6 years, there's actually been a decline. But that decline is nothing compared to the rest of the curve. Now, if you believe that there is a limit to how much sugar you should consume, and the American Heart Association has set this threshold here, and based on the analogy with alcohol that I have made, this would be the theoretical basis for alcohol right here. The question is, do these actually work in terms of understanding how disease gets promulgated? Well, here's the emergence of cardiovascular disease as a health risk in the United States in 1931 due to Paul Dudley White's famous treatise on heart disease. And you can see, as things went up above the AHA threshold, that's when heart disease started to become an issue. And here's 1988 when we started realizing that we had an epidemic of adolescent type 2 diabetes. So you can see that the temporal relation between sugar consumption and our two biggest problems in terms of chronic metabolic disease, that is heart disease and diabetes, are at least temporally related to this increase. But of course, temporal relation is not causation. Now, this is the worldwide per capita sugar supply. And you'll notice the light blue here is how much the American Heart Association says you can consume every day. Notice the entire world is darker than that. Here we are at 629 calories availability, and the rest of the world is, just right behind us because now sugar is cheap. The early history of the sugar epidemic was actually nicely delineated in this piece in the National Geographic just this past month for anybody who is interested in sort of how we got here in the slave trade and all of the other things, the political imbroglios that sugar has caused over the centuries. But we're going to talk about just the last 30 years right now, because that's what I've experienced and that's what I'm interested in, and that's what's led to this adolescent type 2 diabetes pandemic that I have to take care of, and that's what I'm trying to fix. So let's talk about what happened in these 30 years. This is the perfect storm. It started actually with the fall of Batista and the fact that we could now not rely on Cuba for our sugar supply. This caused the increase in sugar production in Florida, which actually took over the entire country to the point where now Hawaii doesn't even have a sugar refinery, okay, because it's now the Florida and the Fanjul brothers. In 1973, Richard Nixon told his Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Rusty Butz, love that name, that food should never be an issue in a presidential election, that fluctuating food prices cause political unrest. Indeed, we know that because just 5 years ago, we diverted some of our corn crop to ethanol, and it caused rice riots in Thailand and caused the ouster of their prime minister. Now, whether or not that prime minister deserved to be ousted is a separate question, but that was the immediate and proximate cause. Notice this slide here. This is the percent of gross national product spent on food by country from Time magazine. Notice we are the worst. We have only 7% of our GDP spent on food. Here's the UK at 9%, here's Australia at 11%, and we are the 3 most obese countries. Notice the countries in purple. They're all greater than 36% of GDP spent on food, and they've all had a revolution within the last 2 years. Indeed, fluctuating food prices cause political unrest. Nixon had it right. Well, with the advent of high-fructose corn syrup that occurred in 1966 and then introduced to the American market in 1975, now we had competition for sugar. Remember, we'd always had a sugar tariff. In fact, it's the second oldest piece of legislation in America dating back to 1789. So we always had propped up prices, but when HFCS invaded our shores, now all of a sudden there was competition. And look what happened. So here's the U.S. Producer Price Index. The goal here is to keep the U.S. Producer Price Index at 100%. That means price stability. Any ups and downs mean fluctuating sugar prices. And you can see what happened in the early 1970s. Up, down, up, down. This is what Nixon was responding to. And notice, here's the advent of corn sweeteners here. And look what happened. Everything settles out at 100% because now there's competition. And look what happened on the international stage. Here's the London price. They didn't have high fructose corn syrup, but we still saw a change, a stabilization in their prices compared to ours. And here's the U.S. retail price for refined sugar against high fructose corn syrup. It was half the price. And so now the food industry could start putting it in everything because they could afford to, because it was cheap. And it was miscible because it was already in solution. So here's the change in high fructose corn syrup and the change in sugar. Now, this comes from the Corn Refiners Association themselves, and they say, well, it's just a substitution. We're just taking something that's cheaper and substituting it for something more expensive. Not quite. Because if you look here, the 73 pounds per year here back in the 70s, up to 93 pounds or 95 pounds per year here, and this is missing something. Anybody know what's missing from this slide? Juice. Because juice is sucrose, okay, and that's sugar as well, and we started making juice like crazy, right? Anita Bryant, a day without orange juice is like a day without sunshine, okay? That was because juice could be frozen and stored. It became a commodity. Fruit is not a commodity, but fruit juice is, and sold on the market as such. So here's juice, and here's most fructose items. In fact, we consume right now 120 pounds of sugar per year. And the question is that over our limit? Based on the American Heart Association, based on the analogy with alcohol, we are way over our limit. And the question is that what's causing the disease? The fourth item. Back in the late 1970s, we were told to go low fat. Why? Well, in the early 1970s, we discovered this molecule in our bloodstream called LDL, low-density lipoprotein. By the mid-1970s, we learned that dietary fat raised our LDL. So let's call dietary fat A and LDL B. We learned that A led to B. Then in the late 1970s, we learned that LDL levels in large populations correlated with coronary disease. So let's call that C. So we learned that B correlates with C. So the logic was, well, if A leads to B and B correlates with C, then A must lead to C. Therefore, no A, no C. Get rid of dietary fat, LDL will go down, and cardiovascular disease will reverse. Is that what happened? Not at all. Not at all. If anything, it got worse. Now, why did it get worse? Well, for a couple of reasons. This was the fight that was going on back in the 1970s. There was a huge nutritional war going on, and it was actually quite nasty, and a lot of name-calling. So over here, we had John Yudkin, who was a British physiologist, nutritionist, physician, who said that sugar was the bad guy. Back in 1972, he wrote this missive called Pure, White, and Deadly. And I read this several years ago and realized that I was just basically parroting what Yudkin had said 25, 27 years earlier. I was really quite amazed that I had just rediscovered what he already knew. Over here we have Ansel Keys, and he was already pretty famous back then because he was the inventor of the K-ration back in World War II. And so he was already sort of on the scene nutritionally, and he was the one who said saturated fat was the bad guy. Well, let's look at his data. So this is Ansel Keys' 7-country study right here. Japan, Italy, England and Wales, Australia, Canada, the United States. Percent calories from saturated fat, and here's coronary disease deaths over here. Looks pretty good, right? Except for one thing, it wasn't the 7-country study, it was the 22-country study. And here are the whole 22, all plotted out. Now, there's still a minor correlation, but not nearly as good-looking as it did before. And the question is, why did he cherry-pick those 7 countries? And why is it that he left out the countries that actually blew a hole in his hypothesis? Here are the Maasai, Inuit, Rendille, and Tokelau indigenous tribes. That's all they eat is fat. They don't have any carbohydrate at all, and they have the lowest rate of heart disease on the planet. So let's read what Keys himself said. This is from page 262 of his own work. The fact that the incidence rate of coronary heart disease was significantly correlated with the average percentage of calories from sucrose, sugar, in the diet is explained by the intercorrelation of sucrose with saturated fat. In other words, donuts. These guys here eat donuts. These guys don't. Partial correlation analysis shows that with saturated fat constant, there was no significant correlation between dietary sucrose and the incidence of coronary heart disease. Now, when you do a multivariate linear regression, you have to do it both ways. You hold one constant and show that the other one still works. You have to do it both ways. He didn't do it. He only did it one way. The question is, why did he only do it one way? I don't know the answer to that because I don't have his data, and this was before computers, kind of hard to check the work. But it leaves a major question as to whether or not this was actually correct. Nonetheless, this started the low-fat craze in America. Now, the content of home-cooked food, you can control the fat. You can decide how much fat you're going to put in your own food. But low-fat processed food tastes like cardboard because the flavor was in the fat, which meant that you had to do something. When you took the fat out, you had to substitute something. Well, carbohydrate. And which carbohydrate? Well, sugar. So here's Snackwells. They're still with us. Okay, 2 grams of fat down, 13 grams of carbohydrate up, 4 of which are sugar. And the question is, which was worse for you, the fat or the sugar? That's the question we're asking today. Here's Berkeley Farms 1% low-fat milk. My daughter, when she was in 2nd grade, brought these 2 containers home and said, "Dad, you're not going to believe this." Okay, so this is 130 calories, 15 grams of sugar, all lactose. And here's Berkeley Farms 1% chocolate milk. Okay, 190 calories, 29 grams of sugar. High-fructose corn syrup is the second ingredient. So when you give your kid a chocolate milk, you're giving them a glass of milk and a half a glass of orange juice. And the question is that okay to do? And the school dietitians say, well, we got to get our kids to drink milk somehow. Why don't we put the fat back in the milk in the first place? That made it perfectly fine, and I drank that my entire young livelihood. Okay, number 5. The 3rd worst hurricane in American history, and it never even hit our shores. Everybody, of course, knows Katrina and Sandy, but this was Hurricane Allen in 1980. And what it did was it destroyed the entire Caribbean sugar crop, which really put a fire under U.S. sugar consumption, because now we knew that we needed to have another sugar source aside from a foreign soil. And that led to this right here. Everybody remember New Coke, 1985? And we revolted, right? And they brought back Coke Classic. Where'd Coke Classic go? That's Coke Classic right there. You're looking at it, okay? Under the wire. That's what you're drinking today. So as far as I'm concerned, from a ubiquity standpoint, we've had our food supply adulterated right under our very noses, and with our tacit approval, because we haven't complained. With the addiction of fructose for palatability, and also because it's a browning agent. It browns the bread better. Well, that's the Maillard reaction. That's the reaction that actually creates hemoglobin A1C, which is the thing that we look at in diabetics' blood to determine whether or not they're getting sick. It's a sign of cellular aging. So if you had an orange juice this morning, you're browning faster. And the removal of fiber for shelf life and for freezing, because you can't freeze fiber. And finally, the substitution of trans fats, which we used as a hardening agent and increased shelf life vis-a-vis the 10-year-old Twinkie, okay? But we know that those are bad, and so we're removing those because we know that those are the devil incarnate, and we're trying to get those out of the food supply. But there are certainly issues with that as well, as Marcia Cohen and I have explored this year. All right, next, toxicity. This is the tough one. I'm going to try to convince you that obesity is not the problem. Obesity is irrelevant. Obesity is the marker for the disease, not the disease itself. Because you don't die from obesity. You die from the diseases that travel along with it, which are called metabolic syndrome. Those are type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, polycystic ovarian disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and the list goes on. That's what you die of. And we're going to talk today about diabetes because in diabetes we got the best data. And that's where the money goes. That's what's breaking the medical bank, the healthcare bank. So here's how you need to look at this. Here's a Venn diagram of the entire US adult population. 72 million obese people at 30%, 168 million people at normal weight, that's 70%. Okay? Everyone thinks these are the bad guys. These are the sick guys. These are the guys costing us the money. 80% of obese people are sick and cost money, usually double the medical expenditures of the general population. So everyone assumes these 57 million are the problem and they're costing us the big bucks. This is incorrect. This is completely incorrect. Here's what the real story is. Let's start at the beginning again. Yes, 80% of obese people are sick, but that means 20% of obese people are healthy. They are metabolically normal. And a paper just came out today in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism showing exactly why they're normal, because they do not have inflammation. They are metabolically normal, they're just fat. Conversely, up to 40% of the normal weight population has the exact same chronic metabolic dysfunction due to inflammation as does the obese. They get type 2 diabetes, they get hyperlipidemia, they get cardiovascular disease, they get cancer, they get dementia. They get it at a slightly lower rate, agreed. But they actually, 40% of 168 million is 67, they actually outnumber the obese. So really, what we're talking about is more than half of the US adult population. So this is not a personal issue. This is more than half of the population. This is a public health problem. In addition, everybody thinks that it's the obese person's fault because it's convenient to think so. Let's hearken back just 30 years to a different public health disaster, HIV. Now, HIV, 1979, patient zero. 1981, AIDS got coined as a term. 1986, C. Everett Koop said, we got to do something about this. When did HIV become a public health crisis? When? Anybody know? 1991. Why in 1991 did HIV become a public health crisis? Because that's when Magic Johnson got AIDS. And all of a sudden, everybody said, you know what? It's not the gays and the addicts anymore. It's not them. Everyone's at risk. It's now us. And everybody realized we needed to do something about this as a society. And it became a public health crisis. Well, guess what? This is a public health crisis because everyone is at risk, whether you're fat or not, because it's not about obesity. So let's talk about what it is. So toxicity, how do we define it? The degree to which a substance can damage an organism. Now, a substance could damage an organism in several different ways, and a nutrient could potentially damage an organism through calories. If I'm going to say that sugar is specifically toxic, I have to show that it's toxic irrespective of its calories, unrelated to its calories, and unrelated to obesity. Everybody understand? That's my charge. I have to meet that bar in order to make my case. Okay? So those are the caveats. It's got to be exclusive of calories. It's got to be exclusive of obesity. It's got to be human data only, because the food industry will say, well, who cares about animals? It's only about humans. And it has to be in doses routinely consumed. It can't be using doses that are so outlandish that you could basically argue that it's an artifact. Everybody with me? Those are my charges. I have to meet those. So here we are. Here's world sugar consumption tripling over the past 50 years, okay? From 50 million tons per year to 150 million tons per year. Notice, Brazil. They used to be so poor, they couldn't even afford their own sugar. They were always sugar exporters, but they weren't sugar consumers. Well, now they're a brick country. They got lots of money. And now they have the highest rate of increase of type 2 diabetes on the planet, because now they are consuming their own sugar. Where is the diabetes the highest? The Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, Malaysia. Why them? Why them? No alcohol. That's right, no alcohol. But they got soft drinks like they're going out of style. Why? Because it's hot, and the water supply is a question mark, and no alcohol. This is their reward. This is their reward. Now I'm going to tell you, alcohol is better than soft drinks. And you know why? Number one, it's way more fun. Number two, alcohol, for lack of a better word, is self-limiting, because you can only drink yourself under the table once a day. I have a little shot glass at home. You know, beat hangovers, stay drunk, right? But the fact of the matter is, with soft drinks, you can keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and that is exactly what is going on in the Middle East today. That is their reward, and that is their oppression, is what it is. Now, this is an analysis called the EPIC Interact study from Europe. And what it shows is that when you adjust for calories and you adjust for BMI, you just look at sugar-sweetened beverages against the risk for diabetes, every sugar-sweetened beverage that you consume increases your risk for diabetes by 29% over time. This is in doses commonly used. This is human data, but it's correlational data. Correlational, because it's a snapshot in time. The question is, do we have causational data? That's what we have to meet, and that's what we supplied. This is a study that we published in February of this year in PLOS ONE. It's called an econometric analysis, and that's very specific. It actually uses what economists use to predict stock market changes and fluctuations and crashes. We melded 4 databases together: the Food and Agriculture Organization Statistics Database, melded with the International Diabetes Federation database, which had diabetes prevalence. We looked at total calories, fruits excluding wine, oils, roots, tubers, pulses, nuts, and vegetables, that's fiber-containing foods, meat, cereals, and finally sugar, sugar crops, and sweeteners. We melded that with the IDF, and then we melded that with the World Bank World Development Indicators database to control for poverty, urbanization, aging, and physical activity, and obesity. We had data for 175 countries, and the countries that we did not include were not different based on what we call a Heckman test. We had a very, very fancy data monitoring and analysis. That's what an econometric analysis gets you. Generalized estimating equations with a fixed effects approach called a Hausman test, a hazard model to control for selection bias called a Heckman test, the longitudinal data to predict what preceded what. In order to show causation, you have to show precedence. You have to show that something occurs before the other thing. In a correlation analysis, you only have the snapshot. You can't tell directionality. You can't tell what caused what. You can't tell if sugar caused diabetes or diabetics drink sugared beverages. You couldn't tell that. But if you have the whole decade, now you have the movie. And now you can determine precedence. And we used period effects to control for secular trends. And we controlled for GDP, obesity, urbanization, aging, and physical activity. We controlled for everything we could control for. And here's the data. During the decade, diabetes rose from 5.5 to 7% worldwide. Here's the effects model. You'll notice it does not cross 0, which means it's significant. For every 100 calories in sugar, diabetes prevalence went up by 0.87% worldwide. And here's the adjusted association of sugar with diabetes prevalence, very clearly significant and correlated. Here's the take-home message. This is what I want you to remember. Only changes in sugar availability predicted changes in diabetes prevalence, not total calories. Total calories were irrelevant. Now, that doesn't mean that total calories can't cause diabetes. That's not what this means. It could. But in this study, for every extra 150 calories that any country consumed, it only increased diabetes prevalence by 0.1%. Nothing. But if those 150 calories happened to be a can of soda, diabetes prevalence increased 11-fold. 11-fold by 1.1%. And here in America, we don't consume 1 soda a day. We consume 2.5 sodas per day. So that's really a 2.4% increase in prevalence. When you consider that diabetes prevalence in America is 8.3%. That means that 29% of all diabetes in America is explained by sugar and sugar alone, irrespective of its calories and irrespective of its effect on weight. That's causation. These data meet what's known as the Austin-Bradford-Hill criteria for causal medical inference. That is, we showed dose. The higher the dose per country, the higher the diabetes rate. We showed duration. The higher they were exposed, the higher the diabetes rate. We showed directionality. Those countries where sugar went down, and there were a few, showed lower diabetes rates. And we showed precedence by 3 years. Whenever sugar changed in any country, diabetes followed by 3 years in either direction. That is causal medical inference. And we estimate that 1/4 of all the diabetes in the world today is explained by sugar and sugar alone. You want something to work on, you want something that's actionable, here it is. And this is direct and causation. This is proximate cause. Now, it has limitations, and I'm going to take it through very quick because of the time. It's not a raw data analysis. That is, it's not person by person. That would be even better. It's country by country. Okay, but it has time, course, and precedence. Now, it could be subject to something called the ecological fallacy. That is, inferences about individuals are based on aggregates. Who says that the people who drank the sodas were the people who got the diabetes? Except, of course, that we know that from other studies where they did have raw data analysis. Could the sugar consumers and the diabetics be different people? Really unlikely. It's food supply, not consumption data, because we don't have consumption data. There's always a concern about wastage, but studies of wastage show 29% wastage across foodstuffs, not anything specific for sugar. And leaving the US out of the analysis, where we waste the most food, did not change the findings. It's only 1 decade, but it was a hell of a decade. Not a complete dietary analysis. Could micronutrients be important in this? Because we didn't look at those. And that might actually be very important. So that's a potential complicating factor. Different techniques used to screen for diabetes in different countries, different diagnostic criteria for diabetes in different countries, and some countries use self-reported data, and most diabetics don't even know they have it. About 2/3 of diabetics don't know they have it. That would only make the data even worse. And the data includes both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, but type 1's been relatively stable on a percentage basis. This is driven by type 2. 90% of diabetes is type 2. So, just so you don't think I'm fructocentric, as it were, okay, there are actually 4 foodstuffs that are metabolized all the same way to cause this same chronic metabolic disease. Trans fats do this, but trans fats are going down. Branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, valine. These are essential dietary amino acids, and the place you get them, corn-fed beef, higher than grass-fed beef. So that might be a problem as well. Alcohol. Alcohol, a little bit's okay, and a lot is not. And same with fructose. A little is okay, and a lot is not. And the reason that these 4 travel together is because they are essentially metabolized all the same way and differently from other calories. The liver is the only site for energy metabolism, so everything goes to the liver. So when your liver gets overloaded, it has to deal with the excess. It's not insulin regulated, so there's no way to divert the calories into another direction. No glycogen pop-off. Glycogen is liver starch. It's non-toxic, so if you make glycogen, you're actually helping yourself. That's why marathoners carb load with pasta before a marathon race, is to up their glycogen, and that's non-toxic. And the mitochondria of your cells, the little energy-burning factories, are overwhelmed because all these go straight to the mitochondria, and they have no way to stop the onslaught. And so what the mitochondria do is they turn all the excess into liver fat, and the liver fat drives the chronic metabolic disease. What this proves is that a calorie is not a calorie. If you believe a calorie is a calorie, number 1, you're lost. Number 2, we're sunk. And number 3, the food industry wins. If a calorie is not a calorie, that's the place where we can exert some action. Now, abuse. We'll do this real quick. Is sugar addictive? Yes or no? What do you think? For some people, just like alcohol, lots of people can drink alcohol and be fine. And there's a small minority of people who are clearly alcohol addicted. About 20% of the American population is alcohol addicted. And it's probably the same 20% that are sugar addicted. And there's something called addiction transfer. Oprah is the world's expert on addiction transfer. Okay? So the lay public seems to know this. The scientists are having a hard time getting on board with this. Now, if you look at a brain of a control patient, you're looking now here at the dopamine receptors in the reward system. Dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter. When your brain sees dopamine, it goes, I like that. Okay, that's good. Okay? And as long as it has receptors to receive that information, you will get reward. Notice, here's a cocaine brain, okay, cocaine-addicted adult. The dopamine receptors are way down-regulated, and that's what addiction is down-regulation of those dopamine receptors. Because now it means you need more of the substrate, more cocaine, in order to get the same level of reward because you have fewer receptors to bind that dopamine. That is called mass action, and this phenomenon is called tolerance. This is what tolerance is. This is the neuroanatomic equivalent of tolerance. Well, here's a control brain over here. Notice there's an obese brain right next door. What do you see? Same thing. Same thing. And in fact, Nora Volkow, the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, has said that obesity is a form of food addiction for many patients. So I'm not the only one who says this. So is there really such a thing as sugar addiction? Well, we have to look for similarities to other drugs of dependence. Nicotine, morphine, amphetamine, cocaine. The one I think is the most appropriate is alcohol because, number one, that's what sugar gets turned into, right? It's called wine. So the metabolism is the same. Number two, it's a market commodity, just like sugar is. And number three, it affects the brain in the same way. Now, I'm not the only one who thinks that sugar is a problem. Let's see, I thought I took care of this. Let's see, why is it not working? I thought we had this working. This is, no, I apologize. I thought we had this working. It is. I'm going to have to pass for this. This is Eric Clapton talking about his addiction to sugar when he was 5 or 6 years old. And I apologize. I had it working before the meeting started. All right, let's go on. I apologize for that. Okay. In animals, here are the criteria for addiction. Binging, withdrawal, craving, and cross-sensitization with other drugs of abuse, meaning that you expose an animal to one drug of abuse for 3 weeks, and you addict them to the one drug, and then you expose them to a second drug they've never seen before, and they're addicted to that one too, because the dopamine receptors are the same, and once you downregulate them, you downregulate them for all the substances of abuse. That's called cross-sensitization. In animals, we have slam-dunk causative evidence that sugar is addictive, done by many, many very, very reputable investigators. What about humans? Now, it's really hard to determine this in humans because, number one, everyone's got a baseline. There's nobody who's naive. Number two, we can't grind up people's brains. The IRBs won't let us. Okay? And number three, it's very hard to show causation, especially with our current diet. But here are the DSM-5 criteria for addiction. Tolerance and withdrawal, and here are all the psychological dependencies. Now, if you read through this, this reads just like obesity. This is what the obese patients tell us. So the question is sugar addictive? So anybody see this movie? Okay, I've got another clip, and I'm hoping this one works. Let's see. Yes?
I was feeling bad in the car, feeling like shit.
Sorry about the word.
Really. I was feeling really, really sick and unhappy. Started eating. Feel great. Feel really good now. I feel so good, it's crazy. Isn't that right, baby?
Yeah, you're crazy, all right.
Now, everybody know the story? Morgan Spurlock was a vegan because his girlfriend was a vegan chef. He started eating McDonald's for 30 days, nonstop, every meal. Okay? This is day 18, and he just described withdrawal. So it can happen to anybody. Can happen to anybody. If you downregulate those dopamine receptors, you're going to need a bigger hit in order to do that. That's called abuse. Now, finally, externalities, negative impact on society. Now, societal intervention says that your abuse of a substance has to affect me in a negative way for us to regulate it. For instance, nobody is saying we should regulate caffeine because your use of caffeine does not affect me. If you smoke or drink or take drugs, though, that is bad for me because of secondhand smoke, car accidents from alcohol, declining housing prices, when your house gets turned into a coke den, a crack den, altered work productivity and absenteeism. I have to do your friggin' work because you're a drug addict. Okay? All the reasons you know about. These are the reasons we regulate these substances. So how does your obesity affect me? 274 million extra for jet fuel. That doesn't quite do it. Discomfort on the subway. Yeah. Sinking of boats due to the weight. 2003, Lake George ferry coded for 17 160-pound adults. They had 25 195-pound adults, and the ship capsized. Ain't going to do it. Here's the reason. 65 billion reduction in work productivity, 50% increase in absenteeism, 50% increase in health insurance premiums. Currently, we are at $2,750 per employee for obesity, whether the employee is obese or not. It's breaking the bank. The employers know this is unsustainable. We spent $245 billion for diabetes and $200 billion for dementia last year. That is 1/3 of the entire medical budget for those two diseases. $192 billion wasted in healthcare resources. Obesity is a threat to national security because 27% of the recruits can't pass the phys ed exam. And finally, the government pays twice. They pay for the corn subsidy, and then they pay for the ER visits. And that's not going to stop because there is no preventative services for metabolic syndrome. We're going to take 32 million sick people onto the rolls, and we can't stop the heart attacks or the dementia. It's going to break the bank, and Medicare will be broke by the year 2026. This is why your obesity affects me. Now, we have toxic substances that are not abused. Now, everything's toxic in the right dose. Even water will kill you if you overdo it. But here are some substances that will definitely kill you. Iron, vitamin D, oxygen, right? Retinopathy, pseudoephedrine until you turn it into crystal meth, then it's abused too. Water, these are all toxic substances that are not abused. We don't have to regulate them. We also have abused substances that are not toxic, like, for instance, caffeine, as I mentioned. Nicotine, until the tars are added, right? But you can buy Nicorette gum down at Walgreens, and it's no problem. But when you have toxic substances that are abused, now you've got a problem, like morphine, heroin, amphetamine, cocaine, alcohol. Well, guess what? Sugar meets all those same criteria for all the reasons I've just laid out for you. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, the American Heart Association says this is a problem. They said, and I actually contributed to this scientific statement, that we currently in America consume 22 teaspoons of added sugar per day, and we need to reduce that to 9 teaspoons per day for males and 6 teaspoons per day for females. That's a reduction by 2/3 to 3/4. Is that achievable? Can we do that in America today? So what does the sugar industry say back to this? What's the politics of this? Okay, well, here we go. So first, what they say is that fructose for glucose exchange studies show no significant difference. And if you look at isocaloric, that is, where you just change the fructose for the glucose at the same level of calories, you see no change. That's what they point to. But if you look at hypercaloric trials, that is, people who are over-consuming, which is what we all are, right? Because we're all over-consuming by 275 calories per day, now all of a sudden you start seeing the effects. And that's what we're dealing with. So what they say is, well, everybody just eat moderately. Problem is, you can't eat moderately because it's being abused, because we're all addicted. So it's a tautology. They also say it shows no significant difference, but the problem is oral fructose is absorbed poorly, so it doesn't even get into your bloodstream. In the fasting state, the amount of fructose that gets turned into liver fat is actually quite low. But in the obese insulin resistant state, it's 5 times higher. It's not fructose for glucose, it's fructose and glucose, because sugar and high fructose corn syrup is fructose and glucose. And that matters because when you do these studies with fructose alone, you don't get much. But when you do them with fructose and glucose together, now the liver fat jumps, it triples. And if you double the amount, it goes up 6 times. There's no asymptote. So the more sugar you consume, the more liver fat you make, especially in the hypercaloric state, which is what we're all in. This is a problem. They also say fructose doesn't raise the blood sugar. It has a low glycemic index. Now, who here knows about glycemic index? So, glycemic index is the amount of blood sugar rise that 50 grams of carbohydrate will give you. And that means the amount of insulin rise that will come with that. Fructose doesn't stimulate blood glucose. Why? Because it's fructose. It stimulates blood fructose instead. The question is that dangerous by itself? And the answer is absolutely yes, because it causes cardiovascular disease by itself because it binds to the proteins in your arteries and causes them to become less flexible, and that starts the foam cell process. It has nothing to do with your blood glucose. A little fructose has been shown to improve insulin secretion, just like alcohol. But that's dose dependent, and as long as you stay under that dose, you're okay. The problem is we're over that dose by a lot. Information on total sugars is available on the food label for everyone to see and for everyone to make their own choice, right? The nanny state argument. Well, that's not really true, and here's why. The Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990 lists total sugars. That includes glucose, galactose, which are no problem, and fructose, all together, and that's on purpose. And the reason is because they don't want to tell you about added sugars. They want to obfuscate what they've added to the food because they say that that is proprietary. If we told all of our customers how much added sugar we put in all of our foods, processed foods, our competitors could duplicate our recipes. This is proprietary information, and you can't know it. That's a problem. Yogurt is the perfect example. How many grams of sugar in a pomegranate yogurt? Anybody know? 19. Now, how many of those are lactose, and how many of those are added sugar? You can't know. You're not allowed to know. Now, how many grams of sugar are there in a plain yogurt? 7. That means that 12 grams of added sugar to that pomegranate yogurt, that's the same as a bowl of Captain Crunch. So when you have a pomegranate yogurt, you are having a plain yogurt plus a bowl of Captain Crunch. The question is, are you okay with that? Is that what you bought into? Was that what you expected when you purchased that item? Yogurt's supposed to be healthy. Not only that, but there are 56 names for sugar, and that's on purpose because they don't want you to know that sugar's been added. Yogurt's another example, perfect example. Evaporated cane juice. Anybody know what evaporated cane juice is? What happens when you evaporate cane juice? You get sugar. Well, evaporated cane juice is not a sanctioned sweetener by the FDA. There are 9 sanctioned sweeteners, and ECJ is not one of them. And so this is misbranding. And 30% of foods in the American grocery store today are misbranded to keep you from knowing what's going on. And here's the list of the 56 names in case you thought I was, a little hyperbolic. So the question is, where's the sugar? In what foods? Well, how about all of them? Okay. 1/3 of the sugar that we consume is in beverages. Okay, fine. We know about those. 1/6 in desserts, candy, ice cream, etc. That means fully 1/2 of the foods that have sugar we didn't know had sugar, like salad dressing, yogurt, tomato sauce, ketchup, condiments, crackers, other carbohydrate products, all things we didn't know. Anybody like wheat thins? Check it out. Next, they say, wait a second, we were wrong about fat. We all said fat was bad, and now you're telling me it's sugar. What makes you think you're right now? Okay? We need more research. Indeed, we do. I don't argue that. We absolutely need more research. But you know what that's called? That's called the pessimistic meta-induction theory. Look it up on Wikipedia. It's a real deal. Okay? This says that whatever we thought 10 years ago is already wrong, and whatever we think today will be wrong 10 years from now. True. And I've seen these cycles come and go in medicine. The question is, why should we do anything if everything is going to be wrong anyway? Why should we change anything? So you know what that is? That's moving the goalposts. That means we'll never do anything. That means we might as well just stick with the dogma of the day because everything will be wrong. Okay? Ask Galileo. That's what they wanted to do with him. Okay? The question is, what level of proof do we need in order to make change? That's the argument for today, is how much do you need to know? Now, I agree, correlational data is not good enough because you don't know directionality and you have these questions about multivariate versus univariate and other things that might be going on. But when you have causal medical inference, which is what we have for sugar and diabetes, that's exactly what we had with tobacco and lung cancer in the 1960s. And guess what? It's still all we have. We've never done a scientific proof experiment because you'd have to take naive people and start them smoking for 50 years. You think any IRB is going to let you do that? Okay? That's unethical and immoral and too expensive. So 90% of what we know in medicine today is causal medical inference. Only 10% is scientific proof. But the food industry says we need scientific proof to make any change. Why? Because they know we'll never get it. And finally, regulation is tantamount to the nanny state, right? Like Michael Bloomberg, right? The nanny. Okay? Well, the fact is we've already been told what to eat. It's too late. Okay? Everyone says, keep your hands out of my kitchen. Keep Lustig out of my kitchen. You know? Fact is, your kitchen's already been invaded and you've already been told what to eat. Because of the 600,000 items in the American supermarket, 80% of them have added sugar, added by the food industry for their own purposes, not for yours. You've already been told what to eat. This isn't about Big Brother. Big Brother's already here. So the big question is, who do you want in your kitchen? You want government who will take your money and your freedom? Or do you want the food industry who's already taken your money, your freedom, and your health? That's your choice. Anything else is a false choice. And the question is, how does the food industry stay where they are? Well, this was published by Michelle Simon, a former graduate of UC Hastings and a former research associate of David's, okay, called And Now a Word from Our Sponsor. And the word and is very specific, A-N-D, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Are America's nutrition professionals in the pocket of big food? Because that's who's paying their bill. And how about this? Co-opting health professionals. I gave a talk at the American Academy of Pediatrics in October of 2009. And I had this slide in my slide set. And the American Academy of Pediatrics says, if you show the slide, we won't let you on the dais. So I had to take it out. But I'm showing it now. So here's what's happened to our food dollars. 1982, 30 years ago. 2012, meats down 10% because we were all told to go low fat. Fruits and vegetables, exactly the same. Everybody tells us, we need to eat more fruits and vegetables. We're eating all the fruits and vegetables we can. Grains and baked goods, up 1%. Not even a big deal. Dairy products, down from 13 to 10% because we're all lactose intolerant. And finally, here's the big one, processed foods and sweets, 11.6%, 22.9%, a doubling in 30 years. That's where the money went, that's what you're paying for, and that's what's causing the chronic metabolic disease. You are looking at it. And this is a war, because what's good for them is bad for us, what's good for us is bad for them. There's no middle ground. It's a war. The question is, who's winning? Well, here is the stock price of the S&P 500 against McDonald's, Coke, and Pepsi for the last 5 years. Here's the economic downturn of 2008 right here. And you'll notice McDonald's, Coke, and Pepsi are doing quite well, thank you. And here is Monsanto, Hormel, ADM, General Mills, ConAgra, Procter & Gamble, Kraft, against the S&P. They're all doing better than the S&P. If you want to make money, invest in a food company because they have a winning formula. They have a formula that can't miss because it's legal and addictive. The problem is we're all dying in the process. So this paper just came out just a couple of months ago in Lancet, Profits and Pandemics, Prevention of Harmful Effects of Tobacco, Alcohol, and Ultra-Processed Food and Drink Industries. And they make the argument, and I totally subscribe to this, that we used to practice the old medicine, which was about infections, and the vector was microbes. That's what I learned. And now the new medicine is something else entirely. It's about chronic disease, and the vector is multinational corporations who have figured out how to game the system. Now, what are we going to do about it? Well, this is a public health problem. And that means we need a public health solution. Now take a look at all of these diseases. Every single disease on this list was a personal responsibility issue before the sheer gravity and enormity of the problem made it a public health crisis, as we talked about HIV as an example. Okay? Every one of these. How about guns? Is that a public health problem? Except that it's a personal responsibility problem, isn't it? Depends on who you ask, right? If you ask the Supreme Court, it's a personal responsibility problem. But it's not. It's a public health problem. And I would put sugar right down there as well. So here we have what the government is doing right now. It's called the Let's Move campaign. This is Michelle Obama's campaign to try to reduce obesity in a generation. Everybody familiar? So what she says is focus on the individual, focus on the family, and focus on the community. But she leaves government and the food industry out. Now, anybody remember her very first speech after Let's Move was rolled out in 2010? It was to the Grocery Manufacturers Association of America, the GMA. And she pointed directly at them, just as I am to you right now, and said, this is your fault. You can see this on YouTube. I'm not making this up. This is your fault, and you have to help come up with a solution. She has never said it again. Not once. Why is that? Why? She's been muzzled by her own administration because they don't want this fight. And I know they don't want this fight because they told me they don't want this fight. Sam Cass is Michelle Obama's personal chef and her point person to her obesity task force. And he told me, after reading the New York Times article, everyone in the White House, including the president, said they're all in agreement and they will do absolutely nothing about it. Not a wink, not a nod, because they do not want the fight with the food industry. They have enough enemies. That's what this is about. And you'll notice Anita Dunn, who actually founded Let's Move, now lobbies for the food industry. And now a word from our sponsors. So the questions I'm going to leave you with are, number one, can our toxic food environment be changed without government or societal intervention, especially if there are potentially addictive substances involved? Did just say no work? Does education work for substances of abuse? The answer is no, it doesn't. Question two, can we afford to wait to enact public health measures when healthcare will be bankrupt due to chronic metabolic disease? We've got 13 years, people, and we've got to do something now, not wait for more research. We have the research. We have what we need. Now, policy, what do we do? What are we going to do? So, there's something called targeted prevention. That is, treat the patient, right? Treat the obese person. Except for one thing, we've just learned that there are more non-obese people who are sick than obese people who are sick. So that's a problem. Now that's the strengths, is that it's targeted to the individual, limits to those who are effective, easier incorporated into medical care, a benefit to risk ratio that's high. The weaknesses are the medicalization of prevention, which is hard to do, behavior modification, which is impossible to do, especially with addictive substances, cost and feasibility, and extraordinarily limited success across the board. But it's not targeted. It's public health prevention that we need. So what are the strengths there? Well, it's radical. It's going to work because we're going to make it work. It's powerful, okay, because everybody's on board. Environmental modification, fix the environment, not fix the behavior. And that's what our data and many other people's data show about obesity, is fix the environment. The limitations are the libertarians, the acceptability, if you will, the feasibility, and the costs. So what could we do? Well, we could tax, we could restrict access, and we could intervene. Now, I'm not suggesting intervention. We tried that with alcohol, and it was a complete and utter disaster. You couldn't possibly, have, stormtroopers, invading people's homes, for baking an apple pie. That's just not going to happen. And I don't even suggest it, okay? Because my wife would be the first one they'd have to take away. What we need to do, like we have with every other substance of abuse, is come to peaceful coexistence. We have to find the right amount of legislation, regulation, to be able to manage the problem rationally, like we've tried to do with tobacco, and we can argue about the wisdom of that, especially worldwide, and alcohol. Certainly no interdiction, but plenty of taxation and restriction of access as needed. So, what factors contribute to increase soft drink consumption? Well, price. Since 1980s, the introduction of high-fructose corn syrup, the price has increased only 50% of that of food. Food's gone up way higher than sodas have. The soft drink price increased only 25% against fruits and vegetables. We're supposed to be eating fruits and vegetables. How are we going to do that when sodas are so cheap and fruits and vegetables keep going up? Because they're not subsidized. We've allowed the serving size to rise. In most developing nations, this is a huge problem. Soda is cheaper and actually safer than water. And it's been said that until potable water is cheaper than soda, we cannot solve this global health crisis. I totally agree with that. Access. Well, it's available worldwide, especially in schools. 50% of flavored milk sales at school now is, that's chocolate milk that we're talking about there. And marketing. In 2006, food marketers spent $1.05 billion on marketing to children and adolescents, and half of that was for soda. So the question is, are children a rational target? Is that acceptable? Why is alcohol so relevant to this question? I actually think that the analogies between sugar and alcohol are very, very strong. And we should look to alcohol control policy. And my colleague at UCSF, Laura Schmidt, and I, and Alan Taylor, who's a visiting professor here at Georgetown, are planning on writing a book on exactly this shortly. Both are ostensibly nutrients, but aside from energy, they have no health value. Metabolic and central pathways in the brain are similar. Both are legal substances that produce health harms when overused. There's little danger from moderate consumption. The problem is, what's moderate and how do you keep things moderate when they are abused? And the burden of harm falls disproportionately on the poorest people who can afford the problem least. So here are the strategies that have actually been shown not to work. Governmental guidelines are useless. We keep saying, well, let's come up with new guidelines, like every 5 years, right? The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. It's garbage. It's not going to work. Public information campaigns have not worked. Warning labels on product packaging have not worked vis-a-vis smoking. School-based education programs, everyone wants this to work. Everybody says, let's put the money into school-based education. All the data so far shows salutary effects, almost non-existent for this. And menu labeling. Everybody says, well, let everybody know what they're eating so you can decide for yourself. All right, well, let's look at menu labeling. I like this one. So here's the adult menu labeling study out of New York City. It's a historical cross-sectional study. So we had data in 2007 before labeling, and we had data in 2009 after labeling. And the question is, what happened? And the answer is nothing. Nothing happened. Mean calories did not change. They actually went up. 3 major changes showed very small decreases. 15% of the respondents reported using the caloric information. And those that did purchased 106 fewer calories than those that did not. But that's almost none of them. Because when you go into a fast food restaurant, you're going for taste. And they say so. Okay? They may say they're going in for a salad, but they buy the burger and fries. Right? And there's a reason for that. Here's for children. 349 children and adolescents, most accompanied by their parent, and most from racial minority groups. No significant differences in calories purchased before or after labeling. 35% ate fast food 6 or more times per week. 57% noted the labels. Well, that's good. At least they had their eyes open. But only 9% reported using the information, indeed. And 72% reported that taste was the most important factor. So do you think that knowing what's in your food changes what you eat? Not at all. So, education. How are we going to do that? Which nutrients are we going to educate people about? Do you think that total fat on the label actually matters? Because there are some good fats and there are some bad fats, and they're all bunched in together. How are you supposed to know? What about salt? Marcia and I have had long discussions about salt and whether or not salt even matters in the American diet. What's the target and what's the message? If it's about total calories, we are sunk. We will never get past this. And that's what we've done for the last 30 years. And you know the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? Well, we've done the same thing over and over again for the last 30 years. And somehow, somebody in Washington still expects a different result. Good luck. Food labeling, right? Added sugar content. Could we put it on the front of the package? Could we put the number of teaspoons in teaspoons on the front of the label, and would it matter? Menu labeling has not worked in New York City. Education alone hasn't worked for any other substance of abuse. Why would you think that this would be enough? I think it's necessary. I absolutely think people need to know what they're consuming, but it is not sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient. What about strategies that might work? So, controls on advertising and marketing have been talked about a lot. Counter-advertising campaigns. Anybody ever see New York City's man drinking fat commercial? It's on YouTube. It is disgusting. It is fantastic. I love it, okay? And it hasn't changed soda consumption in New York City at all. And finally, industry self-regulation. Really. So in Istanbul in 2007, 52 European health ministers got together and agreed that we needed to cease marketing of junk foods to children. I agree. I approached the FCC director, Deborah Taylor Tate, under George W. Bush, with this exact same issue after this meeting had occurred. And she said, this is a direct quote, "I expect the food industry to police itself," which is exactly what they've been doing all this time. It's hands-off. Food industry is hands-off. The Corn Refiners Association, you may remember last year, tried to rebrand HFCS as corn sugar, and the FDA told them no. Well, guess what? They've done it anyway. And you know what? They're going to get away with it. Why? Because the FDA does not have an enforcement arm. The enforcement arm is the Department of Justice, and they got better things to do. They're dealing with drones and other things. Right? How about on a community level? Santa Clara and San Francisco in 2010 instituted the toy ban, right? Why should you coerce a child into buying a Happy Meal just for the toy? Let's dissociate the two. You want the toy, buy the toy. You want the meal, buy the meal. Makes perfect sense. Well, since then, 3 states have banned toy bans. Sorry, let me get rid of that. I don't know why it did that. Okay, let's go back. Okay. And finally, the campaign to retire Ronald, which is ever continuing. How about things that are likely to work? Pricing strategies are likely to work because people actually care about price. Controls at the point of sales, bundling strategies, government agency action. Those are the things that are likely to work. Those are the things that have worked in the past. Problem is, you need people on board. You need government on board in order to be able to enact these. So let's talk about pricing, soda taxes. So Canada and Europe already do this. They have the general services tax or the value-added tax. They already do this. The price elasticity, though, on a can of soda is very small. Everybody understand price elasticity? It's how much of a change in consumption you're going to see with a 1% change in price. Okay? It's very small. It doesn't change much. In fact, the 10% price increase only reduces consumption by 2%. That's not very good. And that's what we're talking about is a 10% price increase, a penny an ounce. Existing taxes on soda so far have not resulted in soda consumption at 3%. So this fits this. Soda taxes, are they for programs or are they to reduce consumption? If they're for programs but not for consumption, you know what's going to happen? Soda companies are going to say, see, it didn't work. Worse yet, some unscrupulous politician will take the money collected by the soda tax and use it for general funds or personal funds. And that's what everybody's worried about, because that's what we've seen already with tobacco. Large taxes are necessary to reduce consumption. Roland Sturm at the Rand Corporation says we need a 36% tax to effectuate a 25% reduction in consumption. Basically, what we need to do is double the price of a can of soda. You think anybody's ready for that? Or should we tax the ingredient instead of the product? Should we tax the sugar before it goes into the food rather than tax the food itself? That's a possibility. The problem is you would need that to be national. You'd need Congress to do that. Only they can levy such taxes. You couldn't do that state by state because of the Commerce Clause. That would be outlandish otherwise. Finally, restriction, controls on the point of access. Age limits. Maybe we should card kids for Coke, right? If a parent wants their kid to have a Coke, let them buy it for them. Okay? I actually, and that would cost nothing. We could do that tomorrow. We do that for beer now. Licensing and zoning controls over the number of sales outlets. Why is there a convenience store within 500 feet of every single school in America? Because the kids are a target, and they know it. How about use permits that control hours of operation? Maybe they can't sell soda between 7 and 9 in the morning and 3 and 5 in the afternoon when kids are coming from and going to school. We have sodas out of schools here in California. We have SB 19. The last survey said that school obesity rates are stable, so maybe that's an improvement, and maybe it's because of this. We don't know. And then, of course, there's the big gulp ban, which was struck down as arbitrary and capricious by Herman Tingling of the New York State Appellate Court, citing Boreali v. Axelrod, 1986. Anybody familiar with Boreali? So this was a case about public smoking. The thing was, it was 1986. In 1990, we learned about secondhand smoke. If Boreali had been decided 4 years later, there's no way in the world it would have gotten decided in this fashion. Well, we have the secondhand smoke of obesity and sugar consumption. It's called healthcare disaster, is what it's called. The fact is, using Boreali as a reason for striking it down made no sense. And this will ultimately be appealed to the New York State Supreme Court. Here's what's happened to sugar-sweetened beverage access within schools. You can see it here in terms of purchasing in 5th and 8th grades. Okay? Look at the arrows right there. So in the schools where sugar-sweetened beverage sales have gone down, That's great, except for one thing. Here's their total consumption. Hasn't changed. Why? Because they get it on the way home or they get it at home. So until we change the entire food environment, concentrating on schools is not going to work. How about bundling? How about differential subsidization? Why can't we tax the bad food and subsidize the good food? Could we subsidize broccoli so that it would actually be in the best interest of the food industry to try to promulgate it? We could. We can modify behavior through pricing. We always do. The Nordic countries have done this. They have subsidized low-alcohol beers and taxed the hell out of hard spirits in an attempt to try to reduce alcohol consumption, and they have been absolutely successful in terms of car accidents, trauma, and also cirrhosis of the liver. And they have done this over the last 30 years. So differential subsidization. We could discount diet soda and tax sugared soda. Now, I'm not sure diet soda is any better, but it sure isn't a whole lot worse. This is the thing to remember. The iron law of alcohol policy says that reducing the availability of alcohol will reduce alcohol consumption, will reduce alcohol-related health harms. The same holds for sugar. The problem is, how do you get there? How about government agency action? We're coming to a close. Regulation of the food industry by Congress is a non-starter. They're not touching this. There's no way in the world anyone in Congress will go out on a limb for this. But why can't the Farm Bill subsidize real food instead of food ingredients? That's what it used to do, but not anymore. It could go back. Food stamps. Remember, Bloomberg tried to remove food stamps from SNAP, from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and he was rebuffed by the USDA. Why? Because the USDA is in the pocket of the food industry. And several other states have since applied, and the USDA has rebuffed them as well. But the question is, why is the USDA in charge anyway? That's like the fox in charge of the hen house. The USDA's job is to sell food. It's HHS's job to keep us healthy. Shouldn't they be more active in this? Shouldn't this really be an HHS issue, an FDA issue, not a USDA issue? The FDA and the EFSA, the European Food Safety Administration, could influence the court of public opinion to make sugar less appealing. You know, cigarettes went from fashion to filthy habit in just a few years when people got on board that there was a problem. The FDA could revisit the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act. And so instead of total contents, labeling could reflect the degree of processing of the food. So what was added and what was taken away, because all food is inherently good. It's what we do to the food that's not. If we add something, that's a problem. If we take something away, that's a problem. Tell us what you did to the food instead of what's in the carton. Okay? If we did that, breakfast cereal would disappear. Gone. The FDA could re-examine their 1986 GRAS determination, generally regarded as safe. One of the reasons we're in this mess is because sugar is generally regarded as safe. This is something that was determined in 1958 with no data. The results were inconclusive back in 1986 at a mean dosage of 50 grams per day. Problem is our current dosage is now 80 grams per day. So we didn't do it at that dose. And the whole issue with GRAS is intended use. No one intended for sugar consumption to be this high. Nonetheless, the sugar industry took that information and said the government gave them a clean bill of health when it was only inconclusive. There are lots of problems with this document. It was based on 1978 surveys at 53 grams, which is just barely enough. No data on excessive consumption, no data on high-fructose corn syrup back then, and fruit juice was considered fruit, not sugar, which it is. So who knows what the real story is? But this is what the 1986 document said, and the person who wrote that document, Walter Glinsman, is now a consultant to the Corn Refiners Association. And there is no dietary reference intake for sugar. It's right there. There's your nutrition facts label. Here's the percent daily value for everything. Nothing for sugar. It's not listed. Why? Sam Cass told me. He said, why would you need a DRI for something that was not a nutrient? Something that is not a nutrient? Well, you know what? He's actually right, because sugar provides no nutrition. It only provides energy. You do not need sugar to live. There are people who have a disorder in their livers called hereditary fructose intolerance. If they consume any sugar, they die. We figure these patients out when they're 6 months old, when they get their first dose of juice, and they become hypoglycemic down to 5, and they are sugar-free for the rest of their lives. And you know what? They're the healthiest people on the planet. And they consume no sugar. You know why? Because sugar is not a nutrient. It's an energy source, but it is not a nutrient. Is alcohol a nutrient? Yes or no? Is alcohol a nutrient? It supplies calories, but is it a nutrient? It's a toxin is what it is, and we treat it as such. Same thing here. How about legislative options? Advocacy, attempt to apply pressure on the government. Good luck to us. CSPI is doing that, Center for Science and the Public Interest, but nothing's happened so far. Legislation has a very long on-ramp. Okay, it takes a long time to make anybody do anything in Congress, and part of that is due to corporate lobbying. Other strategies for congressional action, so far, nothing. How about the Farm Bill? Well, price subsidies cause market distortion. It would be much better to just get rid of all the subsidies and let every foodstuff reach its appropriate market capitalization. That would work very nicely. Problem is, the food industry would have a cow. The question is that okay? Is it okay for the food industry to have a cow? I think it is. Okay. Finally, legal options. This is the statement that got me to law school, right here, the Hyderabad statement from Hyderabad, India, from an Indian Public Health Forum. When I heard this, I went, yeah, that's right. All significant advances in population health require and involve the use of law. That is exactly right. And that is why I came to Hastings to get my master's. Much shorter on-ramp, You can actually make something happen. You can do regulation through litigation. And it's the most bang for the buck if you've got court support. First question, who's the defendant in this case? Is it the corn refiners? Is it any sugar producer? Or is it the distributors and the manufacturers themselves? Hard to know. That's a big question. Many companies, theories to ascribe culpability. Do you do it by, market share? Then Coke would pay for 29% of the diabetes in the world. Okay, responsibility for contribution to added sugar in the environment. How would you do it? These are questions yet to be answered. Would you do this through individual plaintiffs' actions? Would you do it at the state or the federal level? So, they were not successful against tobacco. 845 individual actions brought against big tobacco. Only 2 were successful, and both of those were overturned on appeal. How do you think this would go with something like sugar, which would be even harder? And there are so many different defendants. How about class actions? Well, class actions were a great idea until AT Mobility versus Concepcion and Walmart v. Dukes, which basically said the Supreme Court doesn't want to hear these cases anymore. They're not interested. But there are still 12 states that have class action availability. Misbranding is one, and that's going on right now, and it's going on right now in Superior State Court of California, because there are 56 names for sugar, and total sugars are on the label, not added sugar, which is what we need. How about strict liability? So this is a big question right here. Is soda a defective product? What do you think? If used as directed, does it kill you? Yes or no? What do you think? 11-fold increase in diabetes. What do you think? Yes or no? Other products contain nutrients, so they would be unlikely to be considered defective. But soda? Ain't nothing in a soda you need. In fact, everything in it is something you don't. And finally, failure to warn. Turns out Latinos are particularly susceptible to this, and they get the worst non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and the worst incidence of diabetes. 50% of California Latinos get diabetes because they have a genetic polymorphism that makes their liver particularly susceptible. They need a warning label on every can of soda saying, Latinos, you will get sick from this, because they will, and they do, and I have to take care of them. So where's the label? And finally, parens patriae. The state is the parent. How the Mississippi Attorney General sued Big Tobacco. Because the state is more than a nominal party, they stand to lose. They stand to lose big. They're losing $1.5 billion for diabetes in the state of California every year. There's no requirement for tort liability for parens patriae. All we have to do is show the economic harm and that the state's not a nominal party, which is easy to do. We could recoup Medicaid for cost diabetes and possibly other diseases as well, because for diabetes, we have proximate cause. We can prove it. So for further reading, I will direct you to all sorts of academic papers and more academic papers, and then non-academic missives, Fat Chance, which you can purchase today. This will be out in 6 days, September 3rd. It's an ebook that people can use to go into the store and use it to shop properly, because it lists the added sugars in each food in the supermarket. Sugar has 56 names, a shopper's guide. And finally, in January, we'll be releasing the Fat Chance cookbook, because in order to turn this around, people are going to have to learn how to cook again. And the question is, how do they do that, and what is it they're going to make, and how do they do it fast? Well, every one of these recipes was vetted by a Mount Diablo high school student. And if they can make it in less than a period, so can you. And they're good. So, and lastly, we have started a nonprofit organization to provide medical, nutritional, and legal analysis and consultation to promote personal and public health versus big food, called the Institute for Responsible Nutrition, responsiblefoods.org. Come, join, sign up, okay? We'll let you know what's going on, and you can contact me for more information. And with that, I want to thank all of my collaborators at UCSF and at UC Hastings. In particular, David, Marcia, John Diamond, Pat Davidson here in the audience, and also my colleague Sanjay Basu, who did the heavy lifting on the statistics on the diabetes study that I showed you, Laura Schmidt and Claire Brindis at the UCSF CTSI, and Kristen Carnes, who is the person who is basically doing the sugar documents in the same way as the tobacco documents, and Stan Glantz, who is Mr. Anti-Tobacco and has realized that non-communicable disease, whatever it be, okay, is the problem of the 21st century. We need to solve it, and we're going to need all of you in the room to get on board and help us do it. With that, I want to thank you all, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Just a reminder, a few minutes for questions. If you have questions, if you can make your way over to the microphone, because it is being taped.
I answered everyone's questions. That's pretty bad. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi. Thanks, Dr.
ahead.
Lustig, for that wonderful presentation. Many questions. but I'll
Go for it.
try and limit it to a couple. So the last piece of information you shared with regards to Latinos and a higher likelihood of metabolic disease given exposure. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what we know about that, or where we can find more information about that. We do have a community group here in San Francisco interested in health equities impacting the Latino community.
Absolutely.
Who wants more information with regards to SSBs.
I gave a talk 2 years ago at the Latino Health Forum on exactly this question, Roberto, and it's a huge problem, especially here in San Francisco. What we know is that sugar gets converted to liver fat, but there are certain things that go on in the liver that can make that worse. There's a gene called PNPLA3, patatin-like phospholipase A3. That's not important. It's a gene. And if you have a certain polymorphism, it's the GG polymorphism, which 19% of Latinos have. 19%. A little sugar makes a lot of liver fat. Way more than if you are heterozygous or homozygous for the wild type. In addition, there's another polymorphism for another gene called SIRT3, sirtuin 3, which is one of the molecules that helps the mitochondria function properly. And if you have a polymorphism in that, which Latinos also carry, you're not going to be able to put enough energy through the mitochondria, which means that the backup is going to get turned into liver fat as well. So both of these are known risk factors for developing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a proximate cause of type 2 diabetes, and Latinos are particularly susceptible. The point is that Latinos of all different denominations and ethnicities have to be careful about their sugar consumption. The fact is that Latinos are the least careful about their sugar consumption. They don't even drink water. They drink agua fresca, right? They have more names for sugared beverages in Spanish than virtually, there are in English. And I actually composed a list of it and published it in the Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition back in 2012. It's pretty ridiculous. Rompope, champurrado, and the list goes on. It's really pretty astounding. And, kids, they tell us, they drink it because it tastes good.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I know, but this doesn't mean it's good for you. And we have a real hard time convincing parents, Latino parents, of the hazards of this practice.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. And I know there are folks working on that locally, and we have a lot of work to do.
We do.
So one more question, since there isn't anyone else at the mic yet. But and I should introduce myself. My name is Roberto Vargas. I work at the Clinical and Translational Science Institute's Community Engagement and Health Policy Program at UCSF. The other question is with regards to differential pricing. You pointed to the example in the Nordic countries subsidization of subsidizing beer, heavy taxes on alcohol. Do we have any other examples of that? Has there been any testing of that with regards to sugar-sweetened beverage?
No, there's been no testing of that with respect to SSBs at all anywhere that I know of.
Okay.
What I can say is that there is one study that was out of Peter Ben Brigham Hospital at Harvard where they changed the price in the hospital cafeteria to see whether or not they could get people off sugar-sweetened beverages. And they had to change the price significantly. We are about to embark on a study at UCSF that Dan Henroyd, head of food services at UCSF, is the principal investigator on, where we're going to basically try to do the same thing in a hospital setting, which is very different than, you know, a general setting. But, you know, hospitals have to start this. You know, the bottom line is, you know, it used to be that people smoked in hospitals, you know, and now they don't. In fact, hospitals were the first places to ban smoking entirely. And we'll probably have to be the first places to ban sugar-sweetened beverages entirely, too.
Thank you.
Hi, Rob. Can you just say a little, few words about the reversibility of the condition? So, for instance, what's the duration of exposure to put a child at risk? And let's say they, you know, stopped their soda consumption when they turned in, you know, the age of 20. You know,
Right.
non-smokers or smokers will ultimately go back to the risk for lung cancer over many years. What happens to children?
Right. So there are two issues, Shirley. There's the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease issue, and then there's the diabetes issue. So the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease issue, if it's just fatty liver, it's eminently reversible. It can take time, but it's eminently reversible. We are doing a study at UCSF right now that I'm the co-PI on, where we are isocalorically taking sugar away and substituting complex carbohydrate isocalorically for 10 days. I'm blinded to the results, so I can't give you the answer to that. But we anticipate that we will reverse their fatty liver disease during that period of time because we have data in adults that 14 days of doing the same thing was effective. 38% reduction in liver fat during that time. Now,
Okay.
if
Could
you
I
have...
just ask, just before
Sorry?
you go on, what's the duration of exposure that would bring about fatty liver in a child
Oh, 2 weeks.
drinking? 2
2
weeks.
weeks. 2 weeks. Absolutely. 2 weeks. If you did heavy drinking of
Heavy drinking of soda?
of soda, yep, you would get it in 2 weeks, and you get it in
What's that, a couple of sodas a day? Or
in alcohol too, huh?
what sort of,
Oh, that would be like 3 sodas a day.
okay.
3 sodas a day will get you there. In terms of the scarring that occurs, the cirrhosis, once that occurs, that never gets better. So once you go from fatty liver to fatty liver plus inflammation, that never improves. That's 5% of the patients with fatty liver. They go on to develop cirrhosis over time. Now, you can slow it down by getting rid of the substrate and by using antioxidants, but it's a progressive lesion from that point on, which will ultimately either kill you or require a liver transplant. Now, diabetes is eminently reversible. Type 2 diabetes is eminently reversible in most patients. The problem is not with our current diet. But people who go on the paleo diet see all of their medications go, they don't need their medications within like 8 weeks of starting a paleo diet, once they actually change their diet and their dietary composition. So I think that diabetes is eminently reversible if you do the right thing.
Perfect, thanks.
Dr. Lustig,
problem.
considering the role of ethnic communities, in ethnic communities, which I don't disagree with, what plans do you have for, say, translations into other languages and being able to make it accessible to...
Right. Well, the thing that I'm most upset about is that there's no Spanish version of Fat Chance. And if anybody here is a Spanish language publisher, come talk to me. We have tried to get various publishers interested in publishing a Spanish language version. And there are all sorts of problems with that. I mean, it's in Norway, it's in Slovenia, it's in Turkey, it's in New Zealand, it's in Korea, it's in the UK and Australia. That's English. It's in a lot of countries. But it's not in Latin America, and it's not here, and it's not in Mexico. And the reason is because no Spanish language publisher has picked it up, and I cannot tell you why. So I don't know. I mean, I can't publish the book. I mean, it's copyrighted. I can't publish the book myself. I need somebody to do it for me, but that would be really good. We have all sorts of materials that we hand out in our clinic that are in Spanish language very specifically because that's the audience that needs it. And we work very hard to try to make sure that they get the message. But you know, the bottom line is we don't go home with them. You know, they ultimately do what they do. We do the best we can, but as I told you, education has never fixed any substance of abuse.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lustig. The last comment you made, education is not fixed an addiction abuse situation. So in a stressful society, sugar serves a role. It's satisfying, it's comforting, and triggers dopamine.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about that. Is there any possibility of creating, if you're going to take something away, what are you going to give them?
Absolutely. This is like the Holy Grail, the $64,000 question. If you take something away that gives pleasure, won't they search for something else pleasurable instead? Could it possibly be that they would substitute something even more dangerous in its place? Might they go back to smoking? Might they go to cocaine, et cetera? These are very, very concerning and very worrisome issues. And I don't know the answer to that. I do know that something has to be done about this because we can't afford the health care that's associated with this. So this is an unsustainable model. Now, if you think about what happened with tobacco, let's talk about tobacco for a minute as sort of the flip side of that. When did smokers die? Average age, 64. That's what the actuarial analysis from MetLife said. The average age was 64. Well, you know what happens at 64? You pay in to Medicare, you pay in to Social Security, and you die, and you don't get anything out. This was actually a sustainable model. In addition, when you got lung cancer, how long did you have before you were dead? 6 months. So how much money could you spend out of your health care dollars in 6 months of lung cancer? Not that much. So you paid in, you didn't get out, and you didn't cost society a whole lot. Now we don't smoke, or we've cut down smoking significantly, at least by half. So what are we doing instead? Addiction transfer. We have chosen an addiction which seems safe, except that it's not. And worse yet, it's causing adolescent type 2 diabetes. And these patients are going to be sick for 20, 30, 40 years before they're dead. And their productivity is going to be nil, and they're going to chew through all the healthcare resources of this country, and they're not going to be productive. They're going to be on the dole because they won't be able to work. So the question is this a better model than what we had before? What I say is, let's get everybody smoking again.
Wow. Yes, so then as a
I say that tongue-in-cheek.
So you've said that education alone would not work, but
Right.
but maybe some like pricing policy or something more hard plus an educational model.
Right.
With that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you need, for every substance of abuse, we have needed both personal intervention, which for lack of a better word we can call rehab, and we need societal intervention, which for lack of a better word we can call laws. For every substance of abuse, we've needed both, rehab and laws, rehab and laws. That's what we have for alcohol, that's what we have for nicotine, that's what we have for cocaine, that's what we have for heroin, et cetera, et cetera. Rehab and laws. For sugar, which meets all the criteria, and I've shown you how, we have nothing. So the question is, how are we going to do that in order to salvage our healthcare system? That's the big question. Your point is absolutely, it's the Holy Grail. What's going to happen if we actually reduce sugar consumption? If that's a matter of pleasure. Now, I'm going to say one thing, though, on that subject. Remember tolerance, downregulation of the dopamine receptor? If you reduce consumption, what happens to those dopamine receptors?
Right, yeah.
They go back up. You know what? You get more pleasure. So is it conceivable that we could find a peaceful coexistence with sugar that would ultimately provide the pleasure that you're asking about and still keep our healthcare costs down that I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And I would say the answer to that is almost assuredly yes.
Yeah, and so one of the educational aspects is what is the nature of pleasure? Opioids, endorphins, oxytocins, how do we self-generate those molecular structures in our body to create behavioral states?
Right.
And training that within our education on a societal issue. So that's part of it, is because it's the anatomy and physiology of medicine, but also law. I think that's a question for the legal issue is, what is responsibility? What is self-generation of behavior itself from a legal perspective?
This is the new ethics of healthcare, is how do you balance the personal responsibility against societal needs? And that's why I went to law school, was for exactly that. Public health law, Pat Davidson sitting right here. I mean, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, 1905. There was this pastor in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who refused to get vaccinated for smallpox, said it was a religious objection. The Supreme Court said, too bad. You live here, you're getting vaccinated. Tough luck. And, the bottom line is, there is a point at which every personal responsibility issue becomes a public health one. And the question is, where's the line? And what are the legal doctrines that govern the crossing over of that line? I would submit to you that we have surpassed that for this problem, yet we have not enacted any societal interventions that are meaningful to try to fix it. That's what needs to change.
Indeed.
Thank you, Dr. Lustig. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to other disease in addition to obesity, such as autoimmune disease and...
Well, autoimmune disease is a real grab bag, okay? And I'm going to tell you, this is being televised, this is being taped, and I'm about the science. And the science on autoimmune disease is still very much an open question. So I'm a little loath to sort of tell you how all of this might tie into autoimmune disease, other than to say people are working on it. And I'm very interested in it, but I'm certainly not willing to, go public on it. Not until we actually have hard science. So I'm going to have to sort of beg the question right now. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Lustig. I just wanted to make one brief comment about the idea of if you're taking something away, what are you giving? If you're taking sugar away, what's the reward that replaces that? I have a very small sample size.
By the way, I've never said take it away.
Oh, sure.
I just said
reduce the exposure.
Reduce availability.
Right.
To a manageable level. So
right.
I've never said take it away. A lot of people say I say that. I've never said that.
Thank you.
So don't put words in my mouth.
Thank you. So if we heavily reduce the availability or reduce the exposure to added sugars.
Right.
In a very small sample size that I have, mostly of middle-aged Midwesterners in the United States, I can say that one of the main rewards that these people are getting in a health education program I'm running on this exact topic is reduction in, when you reduce your waistline circumference, people start to notice.
Yep.
And you start getting a lot of compliments.
Yep.
And people really, really respond to that, and it keeps them going. So I know that behavior is not the only, behavior modification isn't the only answer, but it's one piece when people start to be rewarded by observation. And I can speak from being a Midwesterner myself and seeing a lot of people in this area of the country and this age group specifically respond very well to that praise.
I don't disagree with you at all. My mother had a famous saying, a minute on your lips, forever on your hips.
Right.
I know. I got it. I got that a long time ago. Okay? And still, that's the way it goes. Okay? The bottom line is, you can only change your behavior if the environment allows for it. When 600,000 food items have 80% adulteration by added sugar, it's awfully hard to change your behavior in a toxic environment. The toxic environment has to improve in order for you to be able to manifest those changes in behavior. That's what I would say.
And mostly to sustain them over time.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
That's about all the time we have. I'd like to remind you, and I think Rob will stick around a little bit,
Yep.
to sign his book and make it available to you. And finally, I would just like to thank Rob for just a fantastic talk.
Thank you.